The story of of Europeans coming to America begins with this man, Christopher Columbus, born in 1451, probably born in Italy, a man so driven by a dream that he spent his life searching for a way to fulfill it. By the time Queen Isabella and Queen Ferdinand of Spain gave their approval, Columbus had already approached two other kings and been turned down. The events of 1492 remain mysterious even today. The Spanish gave approval very suddenly after long hesitancy. Christopher Columbus seemed to know exactly where to sail, exactly how far away land was, and he was exactly right. Indeed, for years there has been speculation that Columbus was not the first to make the crossing. Suggestions have been made that he in fact had a map that he was following, for there are strange double entries in his log. Of these things we shall probably never know. He made the crossing, got the credit for it, became world famous, and has remained so ever since. Yet Columbus never knew the truth, that he had landed on a continent hitherto unknown to Europeans. He died in 1506, still unaware of his real discovery. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature since before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 at the M.D. Anderson Library on the main branch, at the main branch of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're looking at the literature of exploration, specifically the Spanish literature of exploration, which forms a prelude to the literature that we know as American. The first great thrust of Europeans into the Americas came from Spain. It began when Columbus sighted land on October 12, 1492, an island widely believed to be the island now named San Salvador. Within half a century, Spain had pushed across Central America to the Pacific. To the south, the Spanish had established settlements like Santa Ana on the coast of South America, and pushed down the west coast of South America a distance of nearly 3,000 miles to establish what they called the Viceroyalty of Peru. To the north, they had discovered Florida, established settlements like St. Augustine, and moved across most of the states from Florida through Texas and all the way through New Mexico, Arizona, and all the way to California. In the course of these discoveries, they discovered to the south Inca ruins, an Inca civilization built by a peoples so civilized that they had developed writing and a calendar and built this kind of monumental architecture with stones fitted carefully together, stones carved and shaped and moved into place, some of them weighing as much as 100 tons. In the lands of Central America at this time, there was the remains of another immense civilization, the Maya, also with monumental architecture to rival what had been built in Europe and Asia. And when they moved into Mexico, they discovered an amazing city, this Aztec city, with, again, monumental architecture, the ruins of which can still be seen. The Mayan civilization, hidden in the jungles of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, escaped their notice for a time, but the rest was destroyed and looted. Religious icons were smashed. Tons of gold art was melted down and shipped back to Spain, and turning Spain temporarily into the richest country on earth. And pushing north into the continental United States, they began the colonization and Christianization that led to the distinctive cultures of states from California to Texas. They left their marks on the names so that we have roads like El Camino Real in California, Old Spanish Trail in Houston, string of missions all through Texas and California. They gave their names to cities like Corpus Christi, San Antonio, El Paso, Albuquerque, San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The so-called Age of Exploration took place within the context of European social history. Consider first the first 1,000 years after the time of Christ, the first 1,000 years of the Christian era. During the first 4 centuries, Europe, in fact, was unified under the immense Roman Empire. But after the fall of Rome, which is traditionally dated to 410 AD, over the next 6 centuries, from about 400 to 1000 AD, Europe more or less disintegrated into rival powers, local warlords, a feudal economy, and in fact an economy based primarily on barter. The idea, for instance, of money was scarcely known in those times. This is the background for the first exploration, which actually did touch American, or at least North American soil. Right around the year 1000 AD, the Norsemen made a voyage, and this was recorded at the time and remained in the Norse epics to puzzle people for centuries. Where was the place they landed and settled called Vinland? In 1960, archaeologists working on the northern tip of the Canadian province of Newfoundland excavated a Norse settlement, dated the remains to approximately 1,000 years ago, and came to the conclusion, which is now universally accepted among archaeologists and historians, that in fact the Norse did land and settle on that tip of Newfoundland. But it wasn't a settlement that lasted. And in fact, it was largely forgotten. And we might ask ourselves why that settlement fell apart. Why did it last for only a few years? Why was it abandoned? Well, the answer goes back to that European background. There was no central government in 1000 BC, hardly any national powers. The Norse expeditions must be regarded as freelance, adventures by young seamen seeking excitement, danger, and adventure. They were probably not sponsored. Once they settled, they had no backup, no ships coming out with supplies to keep the settlement going, no continuing supply of settlers to continue the enterprise. And the fact is that in the year 1000, Europe did not have the interest, the will, the central power, or the follow-through to settle a new world. There is a map that survives that is based upon that Viking Norse settlement. This also suggests a reason why the settlement was forgotten. Here we have Europe. You could see the curve of Spain and France, and up here England, Ireland. And if you look across the North Atlantic, you see a piece of land that is probably Iceland, another that is probably Greenland, and this that is Vinland, labeled Vinland. Although the Vikings built this settlement, they obviously saw very little of where they were, so little, in fact, that they visualized only this island. This tiny landfall was all that they saw or knew or even believed was out there. So the Norse expeditions died and were forgotten. They survived only in a few sentences in Norse literature, intriguing and tantalizing historians for centuries until those actual excavations in 1960. In the years following, there was little in the way of exploration. Ptolemy's geography, written centuries earlier, really dominated European thinking. And this is a map based on Ptolemy. You can see that Europeans were basically landlocked. The tip of Africa, for instance, down here is completely unknown. And in fact, Africa extends down to join land across the bottom of the world that allows for no entrance to the Indian Ocean. The mountains and rivers on this map are stylized, not based on actual travel. Land in this map, as you can see, dominates. The oceans consist of only small amounts of blue around the outside. And the world is still a largely mythological world. You can see on this map little pictures that represent an understanding or some kind of conception of what was there. And of course, around the border of the map, you could see figures, not really deities, but at the same time, this was, through those centuries, very much the habit of map makers to sometimes draw on the Roman gods or spirits who were blowing the wind. And so you can sense in the very design of the map a kind of hangover mythological worldview about what the world was really like. And so the centuries rolled on until we get to the 15th century, but by then everything had begun to change. By the 15th century, we have a new merchant class that has emerged. Here we have a Flemish painting that shows these merchants very wealthily attired. And on the table there is a globe of the world, exploration books and maps are open, and various nautical instruments. Back here it's hard to see, but a couple of people that look like sailors are in debate about how to travel. One of them is holding an instrument. And so this signals a kind of new awareness of the world. And the merchant class is really the power that emerged towards the 14th and 15th century that made such a great difference. The wealthy, of course, were interested in exploration for the simple reason that the wealthy were aware of luxury goods. Trade goods, luxury goods, had been finding their way to Europe for centuries. Many of those trade goods found their way along the celebrated Silk Road from China, a route that started at the forbidden city of Chang'an and came all across central China and through what is now the Middle East to Baghdad and then to ports on the Mediterranean, Constantinople, and ultimately to Venice, which was a main distributing center. This is an immensely long route. The map simply doesn't give it real justice, and all on foot or by caravan. We hardly have a conception of how long this route was in existence, but for instance, in the 2nd century BC, one of the Roman emperors saw Parthian horsemen carrying flags with a strange new material that shimmered. And that general gave orders to his officials to find out where it had come from. And within a generation, the rulers of ancient Rome in the 2nd century BC were all attired in silk that had come across the Silk Road from China. No one traveled from one end to the other. These things would be moved 30, 40, 50 miles, sold, bought by someone else, moved along another segment on a pathway that perhaps took as much as 2 or 3 years to finally reach Europe. But the spice, or the Silk Road had been in operation by this calculation for at least 1,600 years when the Age of Exploration began. The other route from the east was the spice routes. Again, we have mention of the spice trade in very ancient times. Even in Roman times, some spices got through. It's really difficult to overestimate the importance of these luxury goods. Cinnamon, for instance, mainly from India, had been coming to Europe for hundreds of years. These little things, known in Chinese as nail spice, because of the peculiar shape of the clove, like a nail about an inch long. Pepper. And of course this, which was one of the hardest, nutmegs and mace. And these spices all came, and now today these spices are available from various tropical countries around the world because they have been transplanted, but in those days those spices all came from a tiny cluster of very small islands situated over in the eastern end of Indonesia. Here's Sumatra, here's Java, Borneo, and over here you could see New Guinea, and in between there, incidentally, Indonesia has 14,000 islands, and 4 tiny islands called Ambon, Ternate, Tidore, and a little cluster known as the Banda Islands were the source of the world's spices. They were not available from any other place. Cinnamon did come from India. Pepper did come from Java and Sumatra, but as far as cloves, nutmeg, and mace, they only came from those islands known as the Spice Islands that I've mentioned. From there, on sailing ships, these moved over to the great empire of Majapahit in Java, then up across the Java Sea to the port of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, then across to India. Sometimes they were transferred and taken overland across to the Coromandel coast. Sometimes they were sailed around the tip of India. And then they either followed a route up into the Persian Gulf to Persia and thence over to ports on the Mediterranean, or they followed a more southerly route to Aden on the southern tip of Arabia, and then up to Cairo. In either case, they were then taken over by merchants in the Mediterranean who moved them up to Venice, and Venice was really the clearinghouse for all spices, Venice and Genoa. And this, in effect, put the Italians in charge of the spice trade, and they made enormous profits from it. It had for centuries. And from Venice, then, it was sailed out through the Straits of Gibraltar to ports in Portugal and Spain, what is now France, up to England, and even further north, up into the Baltic and to ports in Denmark and along the northern coasts of Germany. These spices enhanced a rather dreary life and dreary diet of the northern Europeans. Spices, we can hardly comprehend how important these were. They enhanced the taste of food, particularly poor meat. They also helped preserve and add to the blandness, general blandness of the taste of the European foods. And so Europe was very interested in Asian spices. The problem was, if you look at that map, you'll see that the spices moved entirely through the Muslim world. All of North Africa in the years prior to the Age of Exploration, all of Arabia, all of this part of the world through here down to India was Muslim. And so these spices on their route had to go through the Muslim world, and Europeans were paying profits for Muslim traders. Spices that moved through this route increased in value between 70 and 100 times by the time they got to Europe. These were luxury items, and they traveled by land in some cases, by various kinds of boats, by caravan. Spices here too took 2 to 3 years to move from their source in the Spice Islands to the European marketplace, changing hands an incredible number of times. And in the economy of their day, these spices were more valuable, literally more valuable for their weight than gold. Comparable today, I suppose, in products to something like oil. The true age of exploration began when Portugal, which is right down here on the tip of Spain, Portugal decided to get into the spice trade and find a route to India. It was logical. Portugal and Spain at that time were the two rising powers. They had developed seaworthy boats and an economy that could perhaps support exploration. And it actually began when this man, about 1430, Prince Henry, known as Prince Henry the Navigator, established a kind of institute at the very southwestern tip of Portugal at a place called Sagres, S-A-G-R-E-S. Here he invited learned map makers and geographers to share their knowledge. Here he collected charts and maps from Portuguese ships as they came into port. Here he began the great enterprise of his time to find a sea route to the east. If a sea route could be found whereby European ships could sail directly to the Spice Islands and load up there and bring back spices directly to the European market, they would cut out all of those middle people, including all of those Muslims who you need to keep in mind were vicious enemies of Christian Europe at the time. I mean, Christian Europe and Spain and Portugal resented enormously the Muslim hold on the spice trade. And so they had an interest in several different ways, partly to subvert the whole Muslim trade, but also to establish a direct trade route, lower the prices, and increase their own profit. Just how vast an adventure it was is conveyed when we understand that it took Portugal 57 years from the time Prince Henry started this adventure from 1430 until 1487 to get to the tip of Africa. Expedition after expedition went out every year, 2, 3 years, and they crept down, slowly down the coast of Africa. For a long time, no one believed that it was possible to go around the bulge of Africa. That had to do with tides and winds and shoals. But they did reach Cape de Nao in 1434, the Golden Ivory Coast in 1469. They got into the Notch of Africa by 1474, and finally in 1484 the mouth of the Congo. They had to overcome all kinds of prejudices about sailing in southern waters. It was believed, for instance, that you would burn up in the tropics. There were all kinds of mythologies associated with these areas too, that there were monsters that could swallow up ships, huge whales that could inundate their ships, sea serpents. And while the educated, of course, regarded this as mythology, the typical seaman who signed up on board was a very unlettered, probably illiterate sort of chap. And some of these mythological things were very real. But after 57 years of a Portuguese push down the west coast of Africa, Diaz finally, in 1487, rounded the tip of Africa. Just barely rounded it, planted across, and came back. But he proved that there was a way in to the Indian Ocean, and thus there was a sea route to the Spice Islands. Meanwhile, and incidentally, to give you some idea of how important Prince Henry the Navigator is, here is a statue in Portugal today. And here he is. This is Prince Henry, carved in stone, holding an exploration ship in his hands. And behind him are various explorers who, here's one holding a globe, various explorers who were responsible for the great push of Portugal around Africa and to the east. Meanwhile, the other great maritime power, Spain, was flexing muscles. For several years, a man by the name of Christopher Columbus had been working, lobbying in the Spanish court for what he called the enterprise of the Indies. On the grounds that the world was round, why not sail west to the Indies? Now, Spain was too busy in the 1480s to be bothered with this. They've been working for 400 years to expel the Muslims from Spain. But they were finally successful, and it's very interesting. On January the 2nd of 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella successfully kicked the Muslims out of the southern province of Granada. And almost immediately, having fortified their power, almost immediately they approved Columbus's ventures. He had been lobbying for this for years, and on exactly 7 months and 1 day later, on August 3rd of 1492, Columbus sailed out of the harbor of Spain with his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Shown here are the 3 ships that were built just in the early 1990s, which duplicated that, were built according to specifications, and which duplicated that journey in 1992, the 500-year anniversary. And those 3 ships, incidentally, have a permanent home at Corpus Christi. "70 days later, Columbus made a landfall on an island, and he named it San Salvador, the Savior. This was the first of 4 voyages undertaken over the next 12 years. during which this most famous of all explorers touched upon many of the islands in the Caribbean and on the shore of South America, but he never actually landed in North America. Now, readings for this course include excerpts from Christopher Columbus's journal. The Journal of Columbus presents some interesting puzzles in the reconstruction of something that was believed to be lost. For hundreds of years, it was believed that Columbus's journal had been lost, and it was. The original handwritten version has not shown up. The only thing that existed was an account of Columbus's travels by a man called Bartolomé de las Casas, written about 25 years after Columbus made the journey. And in addition to that, there were a number of passages copied by Fernando Columbus, that is Columbus's son, apparently from his journal. And the fact that we have these copied passages suggests that his son did in fact have the original journal to work from. What is interesting is that in looking at La Casas version, we realize that it's very, very closely based on Columbus's journal, because there's parallel sentences. Here's a good example. These are passages that have to do with the sinking of the Santa Maria. In Fernando Columbus's account, this is apparently exactly copied from his father's lost journal. Seeing that the ship was in danger, I immediately had the mast cut down and the tip lightened as far as possible to see if she could be got off. Now, in the work that we've had for centuries, supposedly an account of Columbus's journals, Las Casas writes, same sentence, when the admiral saw that the ship was beam on to the sea, he ordered the mast to be cut down and the ship lightened as far as possible to see if they could get her off. Now, if you look at that carefully, you might realize that the first sentence is a first-person sentence with the pronoun I as written by Columbus. The second sentence is simply basically the first sentence changed to third person, so that Las Casas appears to be putting into third person the words of Columbus, but attribute them to the admiral. What Las Casas was doing was making notes for a book which he later published, a study of exploration in the Indies. Now, a researcher today would simply photocopy a text. In those days, one would copy out by hand a text to make notes. But rather than copy out the text in the original first person, Las Casas appears to be translating it into the third person. But every so often you come across some interesting passages. Here, for instance, is in Las Casas, another passage. This day I launched the ship and made ready. Notice the quotation marks. And made ready to depart in the name of God next Thursday for the southeast in quest of gold and spices, as well as to discover the country. These are the words of the admiral, who expected to sail on Thursday, but the wind being contrary detained him till the 12th day of November. In the original, it is probable that that last sentence was also in the first person. We could imagine Columbus saying something like, as well as to discover the country. I expected to sail on Thursday, but since the wind was contrary, I was detained till the 12th day of November. You can see the relationship. And Here's another interesting passage from Las Casas' version. He, that is Columbus, states that the Sunday previous he had thought it would be well to take a few of the natives that they might acquire our language and inform us what their country contained, besides becoming Christians and serving us at their return as interpreters. For I have observed, says he, that these people have no religion. Now, the sudden beginning of a quotation like that in Las Casas' version, and that's, notice it's in the Heath Anthology selection, suggests that Las Casas is working along, putting everything into the third person, but he gets to a particular point where the words that Columbus actually wrote seem worth quoting, and so he slips from his third person note-taking into a first-person quotation, and incidentally, that quotation then goes on for quite a stretch of time. Once this was recognized, it was realized that perhaps the Las Casas version was not really an abstract, as it had often been said that it was just an abstract or a summary of the journey. But comparisons of the passages by Fernando and the so-called summary by Las Casas suggest very strongly that Las Casas is not a summary. It is an actual transcription with simply the person changed from first to third. The length of passages, for instance, copied out by Fernando in the first person are roughly the same length as the length of passages from other entries and other days written in the third person by Las Casas, which suggests that he was very meticulously not making notes or summarizing or extracting, but he was actually copying, though into third person, copying the journal. And it is rather astonishing that this has only been recognized in very recent times, and it has led, literally in the last 5 or 6 years, to reconstructed versions of Columbus's journal. Our anthology, if you look on page 117, you'll find that what they use as the text is an 1825 translation of Las Casas, and so you do find in the version in the text this flipping back and forth between first person and third person. But here, for instance, the voyage of Christopher Columbus, Columbus's own Journal of Discovery, restored by John Cummins. This is published by St. Martin's Press, and this is dated 1992. There are others, but this is how recently we've caught on to this fact that the Las Casas version is really probably the Columbus version, simply with the person changed. This has led to a lot more attention to what Columbus said. Difficulties in the Las Casas version were usually overlooked or simply ignored on the grounds that Las Casas probably made a mistake. But now, with the recognition that this is probably Columbus's actual journal, scholars are looking at those mistakes and coming up with some interesting conclusions. One of them, for instance, the double entries that I referred to earlier, has suggested that Columbus may have had a map and with a route from a previous crossing from someone, we don't know who that might be, and that he is in fact calibrating his journey each day with a map journey, accounting for the double entries all along. Other things that have been done with the route that he took. With modern computer analyses, they've taken into consideration tides at that time of the year and averaging over many centuries, well, the last 100 years when tides have been carefully measured, looking for the sideways slip of ships under known tides and winds. And the landing in in San Salvador has been questioned. There are at least now 2 other contenders for an island on the grounds that tides, although Columbus did chart exactly his route and it does run to that island, the sideways slippage could have actually resulted in a distance of 30 or 40 miles by the time he'd crossed. And as I say, there are at least 2 other islands that are in contention. This idea of an earlier crossing may sound like a new one, but in fact more and more evidence is turning up that such things occurred. Here, for instance, is a very interesting map. This map was copied, clandestinely copied in Lisbon from the Portuguese official Padrón, which is the map that covered all known explorations of the world. This was copied, smuggled out in 1502 to an Italian collector. You can see Africa here, and you can see Europe, and across here. Now 1502, of course, is 10 years after Columbus, so you can see the islands here. But look up here. What is that? What is that? Here's a blow-up of the corner of that map. And I don't think it takes much intelligence to figure out that that is Florida. And on the Portuguese Padrón, that is labeled over the green. It's labeled in Portuguese in great detail. This is in 1502. The official announced accepted discovery of Florida was in 1513. But there in 1502, the Portuguese already had Florida on a map. And again, scholars are very interested in this. It's strongly suggestive that the Portuguese had made a clandestine journey. We don't know when. It possibly in the years between 1492 when Columbus landed and 1502 when this map was made. Possibly they had made a journey. But in any case, somebody had been out there, and it's not part of the historical record. It's only this map. We know when this map was dated because the man by the name of Cantino that made the map was hired by an Italian noble, and we have the records of him being hired in 1502 to go and do this, and somehow he got into the Lisbon archives and made this map, copied it from the official Portuguese map. The indispensable book for understanding Columbus is this, the Voyages of Marco Polo. Absolutely indispensable for understanding Christopher Columbus. 221 years before Columbus set off across the Atlantic, another voyage began. In the year 1271, young Marco Polo, age 17, set off with his father on a truly epic journey, traveling east across Asia. His father had already been there and come back, and now his father was going on a second trip and taking his son with him. It took them 2.5 years to reach the court of the great Khan, Kublai Khan. When they returned in 1292, that is 22 years later, Marco Polo claimed that he had traveled further than any other man since creation. And in fact, unless there are records of some travels that have now been lost, Marco Polo was right. He spent 17 years in the court of Kublai Khan. He learned the language. He became an ambassador for the Chinese. He traveled great distances on behalf of the great Khan. Indeed, he traveled to Burma and probably to India. Then, on his return, he decided to take a sea route home. The Khan had promised a daughter as a wife to the Emperor of Persia, and so he entrusted his daughter to Marco Polo, who sailed south around the China Sea, down around the tip of Asia, writing about all of the islands all the way, about Sumatra, about Java, and India, and he, in fact, delivered that daughter all the way back to the emperor of Persia. And Marco Polo, then, his travels were written up, one of the most famous, well-known books in Europe. And there were illustrated editions. Here, for instance, is an illustration in one of the early editions of Marco Polo. This is interesting because it shows the exchange of goods for paper money. And Europeans were absolutely fascinated by that because almost no paper money existed. Marco Polo included elaborate descriptions of the castles and so on, and incidentally, at this time, the Chinese courts were far bigger, far more lavish than any comparable royal court in Europe. His works created a kind of magical aura about China for Europeans. He was read and reread and retranslated, and the lore of the Orient was seeped into European soul. And it's not surprising that Christopher Columbus was absolutely enthralled. He was particularly enthralled by this description from Marco Polo's travels. This is after great descriptions of the court of Kublai Khan. An amazing court. I mean, four wives, for instance, and each of those wives had 10,000 people serving her. I mean, the court was absolutely immense, just beyond our comprehension. And these figures are verified. I mean, this is not exaggeration. They're verified figures from other historical documents. Here was something that Marco Polo wrote. Capango is an island far out at sea to the eastward. And he's talking about the east of China. And Capango is generally understood in all translations of Marco Polo and all scholarly studies to be a reference to Japan. Capango is an island far out at sea to the eastward. It is a very big island. They have gold in great abundance. No one exports it from the island because no trader goes there. The ruler has a very large palace entirely roofed with fine gold. They have pearls in abundance and many other precious stones. No one could count its riches. It's this kind of description that is in Columbus's mind as he makes his voyage. He had no idea that there was anything intervening between Europe and Asia, and it's indispensable to really understand. You really have to understand Marco Polo and the enthrallment that people had for him, and you can really understand what Christopher Columbus is writing about. Here, for instance, is a passage in the readings from Columbus's journal. This is his first voyage, where he writes, "I shall depart immediately, if the weather serve, and sail round the island, till I succeed in meeting the king, in order to see if I can acquire any of the gold which I hear he possesses. Afterwards I shall set sail for another very large island, which I believe to be Capango. I am determined to proceed on to the continent, where I shall deliver the letters of your highness to the great Khan, and demand an answer with which I shall return." So Columbus thought, in landing on islands in what we call the West Indies, that he had really landed on islands very near Capango. And this wasn't an entirely crazy idea, because he had actually, and there were figures of the time that had calculated the circumference of the world. The only thing is, they made a mistake of about 6,000 miles. They thought the world was about 6,000 miles shorter around the circumference than it was. And knowing the distance across Asia to China and Japan, they knew approximately how far they would have to sail across the Atlantic to reach land. But because of the smaller circumference, of course, they reached land at about the right place. But it was a different land. And Columbus was never able to shake himself from some of his ideas. Here's another passage that's also in the readings from the first journey. I am preparing to depart for the island of Cuba, in which place the Indians tell me I shall find a great trade. And it's fairly clear that Cuba he thinks of as a corruption in the Native American languages for Capango, with abundance of gold and spices. Now, he's pretty sure that there's gold and spices in Cuba. But, of course, we can see that this is mostly belief, mostly faith, mostly supposition, because look what he writes. If the accounts which the natives of the islands and those on board the ships have communicated by signs, for their language I do not understand, may be relied on, this must be the island of Capango. According to my geographical knowledge, it must be somewhere in this neighborhood. Well, here he is doing sign language with Native Americans. He can't really understand it, but he is sure from these communications that they are trading in gold and spices and that the island is Capango. So you can see the enormous effect here of his beliefs. Now, again, it's not entirely ridiculous. Here's another passage from October 28th. The Indians told them there were mines of gold here and pearls, and the admiral observed mussels and other indications of these articles. They further informed him that there came large ships hither from the Great Khan, and that the mainland was distant 10 days' voyage. You can see how Columbus is thinking of this as Capango and a 10 days voyage to China, but what's really operating here is Cuba and a 10 days voyage to Central America. The rumors of these relatively primitive Indians on these islands about a great civilization, of course, were references not, of course, to Chinese or Japanese culture, but rather to the immense wealth of the Aztec culture. Well, Columbus went home, was received in the royal court, and here we have a very famous picture of him. Here he is kneeling, and here is Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, and over here we have 2 Native Americans, which Columbus captured. He captured 6, took them back to parade before the court of Spain. Now, after in his second voyage, Columbus made landfall in several places: Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, the Virgin Islands, the Lesser Antilles, and in fact, he made a landfall on South America, but still, of course, the great palace of Capango and of Cathay, which was the name for China, did not appear. But of course, he was unable to give up his worldview, his imaginative worldview, which of course he accepted as fact. Then something happened after his second voyage. Remember, the Portuguese had reached the southern tip of Africa in 1487, just before, 5 years before Columbus did his first and second journey. 10 years after they reached the southern tip of Africa in 1487, the Portuguese sent out a massive expedition under Vasco da Gama, and da Gama successfully rounded the tip of Africa, sailed up the east coast of Africa, and landed in India. That information, of course, came back to Europe. And so a year later, in 1498, when Columbus set off on his third voyage, his illusions about having reached the East were pretty well shattered. He wasn't entirely sure. You see, the East was a kind of complex place. I mean, while he's thinking he might be near Capango, he names the inhabitants of these islands Indians, referring to India. So the idea of where things were in the East was very, very nebulous. India, China, Japan, the Spice Islands, it was all a muddle. But at least the landing of Vasco da Gama in 1497, after Columbus's second voyage, did more or less shatter his automatic faith that he had reached the East, and thereafter he shifts his ground and takes up other beliefs. Now, before we look at his third voyage, I think we need to have a look at the way language and belief works, at least briefly. You recall in treating the Native Americans that I talked about three uses of language, three uses of words. First of all, what I call the labeling use of words. That is, words used when the objects and actions that they refer to are present. Look, here is a book. Secondly, the referential use of words, used when the objects and actions they refer to are not present. For instance, yesterday I read a book. And then thirdly, the imaginative use of words, in which we talk about perhaps a fictional person and a made-up book, a completely made-up situation that never happened, but we write it in such a way as to indicate that in fact it happened. A boy called John read a book at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Well, I just made up John, and I made up that time, and I made up the book. So we have a fiction. And this, of course, is the basis of all fiction. And as I have suggested, in the imaginative use of words, the words create what we call a separate reality, a separate verbal reality. Now, what I mean when I say separate is not necessarily existing in real time or space, but existing in imaginative time and space, a purely verbal reality. Now, there is, after that, a progress by which we move from an imaginative use of words into a belief system. And this is perhaps one way in which we could summarize that. First of all, or number 4 here, imaginative words are misunderstood as referential. That is, the imaginative language of a separate reality is misunderstood or seen as referential, so that imaginary places or imaginary beings, let's say like the gods on Mount Olympus in ancient Greek times, are seen not as imaginative but as referential, that is, as referring to real beings that exist on Mount Olympus. This then leads to the entire separate reality of gods, a pantheon of gods, and their court or whatever on Mount Olympus as real, factual, and truly existing. Now, when stories accumulate over a period of time and get added to by successive storytellers, soon we get to another stage where an entire culture adopts this same separate reality as real, factual, and true. And the result, the final result of this, is a mythology. And the whole thing circles back because now the separate reality in the mythology is taken as real, and we have two things taken as real. We have the real world, to which number two, referential words apply, and we have a mythological word which is thought of as equivalent to a referential world. And so we have these two realities thus vying together. And we could get then a mixture of these two things happening. Here we have Columbus in his third voyage. Columbus attempts to make observations. Each time I sailed from Spain to the Indies, I found that when I reached a point 100 leagues west of the Azores, the heavens, the stars, the temperature of the air, and the waters abruptly changed. I was greatly surprised by behavior of the pole star and spent many nights making careful observations. And he talks about the pole star varying by 5 degrees. I suspect that the answer is that true north and magnetic north are different. Magnetic north is a little bit off from true north. But if you're facing the North Pole, where you're looking at right angles perpendicularly to north and true north, then there's a degree difference. But if you've moved around the planet so that you are looking towards north, where north is on the magnetic north is on the same line as true north, there's no degree of difference. And in between, you have a shifting difference between it. And of course, these mariners had compasses, but they didn't understand this. And since the pole star is literally over the North Pole in such a way that it's very fixed. I mean, it's absolutely fixed. If you've ever done amateur astronomy, you know you can fix your astronomy on that and then operate for hours while the Earth turns. You can align it that way. But magnetic north varies in its angle from that according to where you are on the planet. And I suspect this is the explanation. In any case, he's greatly surprised by the behavior of the pole star. I regard this as a new discovery, and it may be established that here the heavens undergo a great change in a brief space. Now, he's making some conclusions here that verge, I would say, out of what we would regard as the referential world and into a slightly imaginative world. Here we have another passage where he goes on. Near Sierra Leone in Guinea, I found such heat and such strength in the sun's rays that I was afraid I might be burnt. Well, he's on the equator. That's not surprising. And there was a general fear that the equator could burn you up. Although it rained and the sky was overcast, I remained in a state of exhaustion until the Lord gave me a fair wind and the desire to sail westwards. Now, if you followed what we've said from, let's say, the Navajo story of Changing Woman, you recognize that you're in a separate reality at the point where one hears the shuffle of moccasins and talking God stands before the people. At the point where the Lord gives him a fair wind and a desire to sail westwards, we are also here in a separate reality that, I mean, someone from a different culture would read this situation entirely differently. Someone from another religion or whatever would read this situation entirely differently. So it's clear that he's verging out of a referential reality into something else. So he goes on. Now, as I said, I have found such great irregularities that I have come to the following conclusions concerning the world: that it is not round as they describe it, but the shape of a pear, which is round everywhere except at the stalk, where it juts out a long way, or that it is like a round ball, on part of which something like a woman's nipple. The point on which the protuberance stands is the highest and nearest to the sky. Now again, things high and near to the sky have a special significance. If you consider, for instance, Mount Olympus, home of the gods, Mount Sinai, where the laws were handed down to Moses, Mount Bromo on the island of Java, the Hindu creation god, it's the mountain of the Hindu creation god, and so on, many other examples. The general mythology associated with high places is that they are more sacred. So we can see him leading here to something. Now, then he goes into a series of observations, and he talks about the whole discoveries of this voyage. On this voyage, 20 degrees north of the equator, the people are black and very parched. Now here we're going to see some built-in prejudices and built-in biases of an ethnocentric European. He's pale. Dark people live down there on the equator. And of course, there's a built-in superiority here of whites. On this voyage, 20 degrees north of the equator, the people are black and very parched. I then went to the Cape Verde Islands, which incidentally is further south, whose inhabitants are blacker still. And the farther south I went, the greater the extremes. And of course, in between this, he's also talking about the weather, and he's talking about the behavior of the pole star. At Sierra Leone, the people are completely black. The heats remained excessive. And here we can see the explanation that Europeans had for the dark skin of tropical people. And of course, it is true that dark-skinned people do inhabit a band along the equator across Africa, India, Southeast Asia, the Polynesian Islands, and it is true that as you move north, you get lighter skin. That's an empirical fact. It's also has a scientific explanation. You know, that's a survival device that prevents. I mean, if you've ever gone out on spring break on Galveston Island and got a sunburn, you quickly appreciate the liability of a fair skin. So what he's seeing is true, but there's a built-in value judgment in all of this. And so he goes on. He says, on passing the line of which I have spoken, I found the temperatures growing milder. Now, temperatures growing milder is a clear sign of them getting better. That's less like an equatorial climate and more like a European climate. I found the temperatures growing milder, so that when I came to the island of Trinidad, the temperatures were extremely mild. The inhabitants were fairer. He's gone south through these darker and darker and darker till they're nearly black people. Then suddenly he crosses a line, everything changes, and he finds mild temperature and fairer people. Their hair was long and straight. Of course, Europeans have long, straight hair, which is clearly superior to the tight curls that you find among equatorial dark-skinned people. And they were quicker, more intelligent. And look at this sentence. All this is attributable to the fact that this land stands highest on the world's surface, being nearest to the sky, as I have said. That's why it's cooler. That's why the people are fairer. This confirms my belief that the world has this variation of shape, like a pear. And if this isn't begging the question, I mean, it's a classic case of begging the question, assuming the conclusion before you've done the proof. But of course, this sort of thing would pass as a scientific proof in his day. And so we move then to his grand conclusion. Holy Scripture testifies that our Lord made the earthly paradise. From it there flowed four main rivers, the Ganges in India, the Tigris and Euphrates in Asia, and the Nile. I mean, that's there in Genesis. Keep in mind that for rivers to all flow out from a central place, that place has to be higher than the world around. So this all fits his idea that there's a pear-shaped world and there's a high place on the world from which all these rivers flow. And keep in mind, too, because of his smaller circumference of the world that he's calculated, he believes that one half of the world is the Asia-Europe complex. But by sailing out into the Atlantic, he is now on the other side of the world. Okay? Which, I mean, he's really only a third of the way around the world, but he thinks he's on the other side of the world. He thinks he has moved right a lot around into the eastern areas to the source of rivers like the Indus, the Nile, the Ganges, and so on. And so he says, I believe that if I, going back to on the screen, I believe that if I pass the equator, I shall find a cooler climate. Not that I believe it possible to sail to the extreme summit, or it is even possible to go there, for I believe the earthly paradise like here, which no one can enter except by God's leave. These waters may flow from there to this place which I have reached. So, having had his belief that he is in the Capango region shattered, the belief he had for his first two voyages, shattered by Vasco da Gama reaching the Indies in his third voyage, he shifts his mythology and now believes, as this passage, a very good passage chosen in the text, as this passage suggests, he believes that he has perhaps come close to discovering the earthly paradise. Scarcely any passage in literature reveals this mixing of actual empirical evidence and observations with an inherited mythology. It's a beautiful passage to illustrate this kind of thing. At root, it rests on an inability to distinguish what we have called a referential use of language from an imaginative use, that is, a fact from a mythology. An imaginative structure thousands of years old has here been imposed on his observations. And of course, Eurocentric values fit in here too, that fairer skin is better, that long hair would be, of course, what Adam and Eve would have in paradise. Such a passage in Columbus, of course, is useful for another purpose. After reading Native American literature, it's easy to sit back smugly, perhaps a little condescendingly, and think, oh, they have talking God, and they have a woman like Whoopi who comes and gives the pipe, and she is resident in smoke, and so on. But it's terribly easy to say how enlightened we of European descent are in comparison, but when you look at Columbus, you could see that the Europeans who came here were just as much locked into a mythology, a very ethnocentric mythology, and they read the world in certain ways according to that mythology. And we're going to see, in fact, that for the next 200 years, from 1492, when Columbus landed, all the way up to 1692, when in New England they were executing women for witchcraft, the same sort of mythology dominated empirical observation. Mentally, emotionally, and socially, these people were locked into a mythological view of the world which affected everything else. And this will not really change until the 18th century and the Age of Enlightenment. Well, have a good day.